Today's modern working professionals expect a learning experience that reflects the world we live in. Canvas LMS is built to help organizations unlock the potential of skills-based learning by focusing on what matters to learners and their educators. From dynamic course delivery to adaptable credentialing, Canvas empowers learners to thrive in a rapidly evolving landscape. See what it's all about at canvas.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer. I am your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us Marty. Marty is a clinical psychologist turned entrepreneur turned business coach. Lots of different hats there. Hello and welcome, Marty.
Hi, I'm looking forward to the conversation, Alex.
We are going to chat about your book, Blindspotting: How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader Today. But first, let's chat about you and your very interesting career story. How did you land in your current role? And tell us some of the accidents that maybe happened along the way.
So my current role is author and speaker, I guess, and total accident. During COVID, had kind of cut back my work. I'd had an unusual career, as you just said, and I just started writing about what I'd learned from my patients when I was a psychotherapist, what I'd learned from my business clients, what I'd learned as being a startup founder, CEO, and all of that. And it was just kind of pouring out the questions I still had, what I thought I knew, why did I say what I said to somebody, and what had helped and what hadn't helped. And then after about 3 months, I think, of that, all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, this is a book. I should get serious about it, organize it. What's my point of view? So the whole book itself has been an accident and a lot of serendipity on the way. Any of your listeners who have written and published a book know that there's just lots of steps to make that happen. So here we are 4 years later, and I'm talking to you.
That's incredible. So you have a really interesting model framework in this book. And it wasn't something that you were doing in your coaching work, or you were, but it hadn't taken this more polished shape yet.
Correct. Yeah, so here we go, another accident. I had gotten the book kind of together, kind of in an outline form, somewhat detailed, sent it to one of my colleagues that I had worked with and said, what do you think? And she said, this is great, these six areas to look for blind spots. She says, but if I'm meeting with a client, I want to draw it on a napkin for them. And I said, I know, I've been just struggling with what's the visual for this. And there's 6 things. Is a hexagon right? And I thought, no, it doesn't really represent what it is. So I worked on it intellectually, let it sit, and it just finally kind of developed. So the visual picture for your listeners is kind of like a target, 3 concentric circles, a little bullseye in the middle, another middle layer, and an outer layer.
I am glad you described the visual, because I mentioned to you when I first picked up this book, I was thinking about the Clifton Strengths Finders, and I call them buckets. And I'm pretty sure they don't call them buckets, but that is how I remember them. They're pillars, 4 pillars next to each other. And this really drew me in and got me excited. Once I was able to see that visual, all of a sudden it made me start to see the interconnected relationship between the blind spots. So let's make sure that we're making that really clear to our listeners who don't know what those are yet. Tell us what these 6 leadership blind spots are a little bit.
Yeah, so big picture, as a clinical psychologist, people are very complicated. We are all very complicated. And if you sit down to talk to somebody, conversations meander and go all over. And so what really is important here to focus on? And as a psychologist, kind of like a detective, that's how I've always viewed my work. Is it's easy to just jump on something, but is that really going to make a difference? Are you just dealing with a little surfacey symptom or how the person sees it, and not really, they're there to get the book is about self-awareness. So that's simply what this book is about. And so these 6 areas give you kind of a way to organize your thinking as you're talking to somebody or for yourself. So the 6 areas, I'll describe them how they appear in the model. So on the outside layer are 2 areas, identity and behavior. And those are on the outside because those are closest to our awareness. Our identity is kind of the name tag we wear, You're a podcaster, you're a trainer, whatever it is, what you're, a mother, you're a parent, whatever those things are, that's our identity. And we'll talk about how you can get blind spots in that. And the other one on the outside is our behavior. we're not always aware of what we're doing, but it's pretty easy for us to pay attention. Oh, that's what, I'm saying this now, I'm behaving this particular way. Then in the next layer in are three that are more fixed in our personality, and there's a lot of psychological research to support that statement. So it's our traits, which is really what StrengthsFinders is all about. And most things that your listeners are familiar with are trait tests, because they're probably the easiest thing, quite frankly, as a psychological test to get an assessment of. So those are the adjectives we use to describe ourselves. Also in this inner layer are our emotions and all those things your listeners know about EQ, fit generally, and I talk about a few other things in addition to that in the emotion category, and our intellect. I mean, we know those three things are kind of different things. Our traits, our intellect, our emotions, they all influence each other, but they're all separate kind of categories. And then the bullseye in the center is kind of the engine in the system. This is the hardest for us oftentimes to get aware of, and that's our motives, our drives, our needs. What's really pushing us to do what we're doing? So they all feed back on each other and push and pull and tug and influence each other. But from a helping yourself and helping other people, some are more relevant at particular times, or we can get a hold of them a little bit better and be able to make some changes. So I talk about how they're interconnected, but I talk about how they're each distinct.
Yes, you package it nicely in terms of breaking up the different blind spots into different chapters so you can focus on them each distinctly at a time. And I want to start with identity, just as you've moved through your book. But you also mentioned just now that people are complicated, conversations can meander. I never feel that so deeply as when I'm having a podcast conversation and I want to create this experience where you walk away with something actionable as the listener. But as I'm talking, I'm like, oh, let's go down this trail. So that is the push and pull of just being human. So thanks for articulating that for us. And that can be a challenge, as when you're having a podcast conversation, you're like, should we just follow this organic conversation? I also wanted to jump into this story about Marcus, because you set up our understanding of blind spots by following a leader, and you're retroactively poking through what his weaknesses were or kind of what led to his demise. Maybe you can tell us a little shorter version of Marcus's story as a way to see the consequences of what happens when we don't address or are not aware of these blind spots. Then we can kind of unpack a little bit, each one a little further.
Yeah, and to do a little meandering here for a second, so you mentioned weakness, and that is something that I've stricken from my language.
Yes, I know. As I said, I was
Yeah.
like, he doesn't use that.
No, and that's purposeful because it's not
That's
useful.
all positively. Yes.
Well, it's not even that it's positive. It's just we are who we are. And so it's more important to understand the terms I use are gifts and gaps. What are our gifts? Because our gifts can become problems, and we'll talk about that. And the gaps are areas that we just, we all are pattern recognizing organisms. That's how we survive. And so certain things we just don't pay attention to. They're outside our awareness just based on all of our makeup and our life experiences. So you need to be aware that you have gaps in certain areas, and how you can compensate for them, often by having other people around you who are good at those areas where you're gaps. But anyway, so that's one just overall kind of sense. So the book, as you indicate, is story driven, and that's what I have. I'm not a researcher. I've had a life of experience of coaching and treating as a clinical psychologist, lots and lots and lots of people. So these are real stories that obviously have been changed in the book to maintain people's confidentiality. So Marcus was a great representative of all 6 of these blind spots. He was a startup founder. So I worked a lot in Silicon Valley with venture capital and startups. Unbelievably successful. This guy was, worth tens and hundreds of millions at a point. He'd had a couple of very successful products, things that your listeners probably had in their homes or on their phones, and starting a new one. One concept in the book that fits into many of these blind spots is you can overuse your strengths, and your strengths have this underside of when it's a problem. And we don't realize that because there are strengths and they work for us 90% of the time. The blind spotting concept in the book is about that 10 or 15% when who you are doesn't fit the situation. It's not a weakness. You're not a problem. You are who you are. But certain situations you're great in, certain situations fit like a jigsaw puzzle who you are. So real quickly with Marcus, his identity was an innovator. That's what all startup founders need to have that. But at some point, that identity needs to shift because once your products start to be successful, you need to build a business. You need to learn about legal and HR and all sorts of things that maybe don't come natural or you're not even interested in. But then the other shift in role and identity for startups is to become a leader. Really realize you've got experts around you and your job is to lead all of them, empower them to be the best. Marcus could not see this switch. He did a pretty good job as a business builder, but his heart was monkeying with his product and being interested and wanting to be in every meeting where new and fancy things were happening with his product. So he was slowing the process down. He wasn't paying attention to what he should. And that became, with some of these other blind spots, a fatal flaw for him. He also was very bright and he relied too much on his intellect and not on some other aspects of intellect that I talk about in the book, creativity and other kinds of things. He was brilliant at creating a vision. So this is in the trait category, and he could get people super excited and he loved telling the story. And he was motivated, quite frankly, by fame. Now he wanted to make money, just really enough money to live his fancy lifestyle, but his investors lost millions in dollars because he really ultimately didn't really care about money, certainly money for anybody else, just money enough to live by, but he really wanted to be in the spotlight. So he was flying around, generating more interest, getting more investors in the company when he should have been sitting there at headquarters figuring out some of the problems that were showing up with his product. And there were a few other pieces of this, but you get a sense now where a number of different blind spots were kind of coming together in a storm for him that just was the perfect storm to, quite frankly, killed the company. And he lost hundreds of millions of dollars of other people's money and a lot of his own.
Yeah. You kind of reveal that later in the story. You mentioned he sort of had gaps, blind spots in all of these different places. Let's talk about identity. You have so many stories, as you said. Even within each chapter, we start with Elizabeth, but we visit other people in the identity chapter. I'm thinking now there's like the entrepreneurial identity traits, there's the general business ones, there's more personal, deeper ones. So how do we make sense of identity?
Yeah, I think I know a lot of your listeners are L&D professionals and in HR. So an identity blind spot is when your identity and your role are not aligned, when there's a misalignment. And here's a perfect example that I think your listeners can relate to. Somebody's a subject matter expert in marketing, engineering, whatever it is, and they get that promotion to be a manager, supervisor at that next step. That is a role shift. And if their identity has been up until then to be a subject matter expert, know the most about what their domain is. And for them to move to the next step, they have to give up a piece of that identity. Now their identity has to be, I'm a leader of other people. I'm a manager of other people. There's a science of management. There's a science of leadership. I need to learn about that, shift my focus from being learning everything I could about marketing or engineering or whatever it was. And there needs to be, quite frankly, if you actually do that, there should be some sense of grief of giving up that past identity to
It goes to the motion piece.
Absolutely. And if you don't have a little bit of grief about it, then you're probably not shifting your identity. And so I'm sure your leaders know a lot of people who failed at that shift because they couldn't quite, and maybe they ultimately shouldn't have made the change that, we can go back to motive, what really drives them. But anyway, at any of those shifts, and certainly as you go up the corporate ladder, become a leader of other managers, a leader of leaders a corporate leader. So at every one of those steps, the role shifts and it requires you to change what that little name tag is on yourself, about how you introduce yourself and what you're focused on. and to try to get your identity and your role well aligned.
That's such a great example that if you haven't grieved, then you probably haven't done the identity shift. A good gut check, like that conversation, if you're talking to someone, if they've revealed that they haven't gone through the grief, then it could be a red
Yeah.
flag opportunity to
Yeah.
dig further and see where they are in that journey of doing the identity shift.
And on the front end of it, here's another just little tidbit. If you're getting ready to shift to that new identity, or you want that promotion to whatever that next step is, I recommend people begin to act as if you already have that new role. Now, not in a way that's going to be stepping on toes and being obnoxious about it, but you should start to think about what's the role, what's my boss's role that I want to get to? What are they worried about? What keeps them up at night? And begin to get your head and your whole self kind of prepared. How do they show up differently at work than, do they walk around the office as much as I do, or more or less, or just all those behavior changes, and find out, does this new role seem to fit for me or not? Am I getting excited as I think about it or not? So again, the prep on the way in, and once you're in, that whole grief sense should be there as well in terms of, shifting your identity and your role to be aligned.
This is a fun example because I was thinking about what happens for many people in our community that I hear is they have to wear many hats. And I was like, is this a motive question or an identity? But maybe it's all, and it totally depends on all sorts of things. But I want to describe a common struggle that I hear is someone is the designer and they're the strategist and they're the leader and they're the subject matter expert. They're being pulled in a lot of different directions, and there's a lot of competing priorities and a lot of stress that comes with that. And I can imagine how when you look at the behavior and you look at the actions, maybe things are lopsided. They're not evenly spread as maybe supposedly it would look like what all of these roles are that they are supposed to and meant to achieve. What do you want to say to someone who identifies very deeply with having to have all of the hats?
Well, I love the question because it goes to the heart of how complicated we are as people and how much is going on and how interconnected and organic it all is. So here's a couple thoughts I have about that. One is that when you wear multiple hats, there's a couple jobs that have to be going on all the time. You have to try to be self-aware. What hat am I putting on right now? And that is also what hat is the environment or my job or whatever's going on telling me I should be putting on. Now they're saying I need to take this hat off that I had and I need to put this other one on because I've been asked to do this now or whatever it is. And the other piece of that is often I've worked with people who they think they're clear about what hat they're wearing, but everybody else doesn't. I coached, again, a startup founder who was a physician, and he thought he was being the CEO all the time. And everybody else said, no, you're not doing what a CEO does. You're being the doctor, chief medical officer, and giving advice that's really medical advice or medical questions and so on. Being able to articulate and advertise to whoever you're working on, oh, now you want me to do this? I was just talking to you as the HR leader. Now you want me to be the designer. I'm going to put that hat on now. And so you're really making sure that everybody understands, you and everybody else, what hat you're wearing. And that clarifies where the conversations begin to go. So that's one thought. The other thought, I have a point in my book where in the behavior chapter, where I talk about prioritization. And this is so key, I think. We all have way too much to do in our jobs. And figuring out what's priority, and which means back to the role of the job and what really is required versus what do I like to do? What fires am I going to put out right now? So the question, and this comes from an article from HBR quite a while ago, and it was about CEOs. What can only the CEO do? In every role, there's certain things that only the person in that role can do. And that is your job. Now you do other things in addition, but when you strip it all back, there are some key things. There's an exercise to go through to try to figure out what can only you do in that role. And so that would be the other advice to those people that have too much to do. Like, what is my role here? and being clear about that. And sometimes it requires setting some boundaries or having some difficult discussions about that isn't really my role, to go design right now. And now we need to talk about whether I should do that or not, or how that makes me, decrease what I was doing in my core role.
I love this question that you can ask yourself, but you can also use it as a coaching question. Of course, this is how the book is designed, where it could be used for your own personal self-reflection or self-awareness work. And you can also help someone else do it by helping provide these types of questions to do the work. You said something that made me think about decision making, and I want to jump to motives, which you said can be hardest to have awareness about. What does that look like in practice, this blind spot? How can you notice it? How can you get more clarity around it?
Yeah. So first off, in most situations, we are multi-motivated. We're motivated by more than one thing. And we're probably adjusting those motives all the time. What's more important right now? Do I have that extra dessert, or am I, focused on my health and I shouldn't do that? And then there are times when we're under tremendous stress, and the whole fight flight response, what that is really saying is we have a single motive: survival at that point. And so every other motive just falls by the wayside and our behavior becomes very focused. So number one is be aware of how much stress you're under, because as you become more stressed, your motives become more constrained. And so in some ways it makes it almost easier to figure out what your motives are, because a lot of things that you might be interested in fall by the wayside at that point. But then asking yourself just those questions of why. Motive is why questions. Why am I doing this? Why is that important? Why do I want this or that? And we ascribe motives to other people all the time, right? Oh, he's only doing it for the money. Oh, she only cares about being in the spotlight. So those are, maybe that's true, but we need to be aware that other people are intuiting our motives all the time. And that's part of how we survive. What's our boss feeling today? Or what's my colleague, do I need to give my colleague a hug or not? The whole awareness in the book is, once you figure it out, or you think you figure it out, talk about it. Is that what's really important to me right now? What am I struggling with? The blind spots occur when we're not aware of our motives, and we're being driven by things that really may or may not actually be the best direction for our behavior in the situation. We may be responding based on some historical, this is a good part of being a psychotherapist, people are driven in the present by things that happened to them in the past, and they're not that aware of it. A lot of therapy is uncovering what is driving you, and those are really things from when you were a child, and you're not a child anymore.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned it's the why questions. This happened to me recently, where I was flared up with a sort of, why did they do this? This makes me angry. And then I was chatting about something with my manager and realized, oh, he kind of helped remind me that other people have different motives, much different motives and different priorities than me. I'm like, oh yes, so that is why.
And I love you said that. Emotion is the royal road to your motives.
Yes.
When you're feeling something so strongly, could be a positive feeling or negative, feeling, and it's a bit like, why am I feeling that? Or why did I feel that yesterday? That's the time to say, what was motivating me? So if it's a positive feeling, it probably means some basic drive was getting satisfied. You were feeling lonely and somebody gave you a hug and all of a sudden you started tearing up. Or you were angry, as you just said. So that is when a need or motive is getting blocked and you're getting frustrated.
I was going to look at the term that you use for emotion. I don't know how to pronounce this word. Like when I read it, facile.
Facile. Yeah, right.
Tell us how to pronounce it. Why do you use that phrase? What does that mean?
Yeah, it being sophisticated, having a lot of, ability to manage. So yeah, with our emotions, and that's in the emotion chapter, and blind spots occur in different ways here, but the ultimate goal is being very flexible. Maybe is another way to talk about facile is, you can recognize what those motives, what those emotions are, still being authentic and not turning into some kind of robot. You can be very deliberate about how you show your emotions. Maybe you are a pretty, easygoing person and you don't get angry or upset. And you're sitting there thinking like, this is so important what we're talking about right now, and nobody is really taking it seriously. You could pound the table and imagine how everybody looks at you because it's like, oh, she never pounds the table. What's going on? And you're doing that, you're feeling it, but you're actually doing it deliberately because you want to send the message, hey, pay attention. And maybe you're even wanting to send the message beyond the 5 people in the room with you who then go out afterwards and say, Alex was so upset she pounded the table. Can you believe it? She really cares about X. Let's pay attention to it. So that's being facile and sophisticated and deliberate about knowing your emotions and then using them in a productive way.
I'm sure you have thoughts about emotional regulation. I feel like I see a lot of folks say that this is work that you should work on and learn when you're like in kindergarten, but somehow that doesn't always happen. And people are adults and they're learning. Maybe sometimes they often are learning with a coach for the first time how to have some emotional fitness and emotional mastery. What are your recommendations for making that happen?
Yeah, so this is again back to we're all different. We all have different set points in all of this. Some people are very emotional and their emotions are out there and they feel them and they share them and some people are very calm and they're not necessarily buttoned up. They just their set point is, much lower. That takes, for something finally to get them upset or much higher.
Yes.
So yeah, it's knowing that all about yourself. So I talk about 5 steps of emotional mastery. One is bandwidth. I think emotions are data. Emotions are important. I've worked with lots of engineers who are like, wish emotions, and business leaders who say they're just getting in the way of business. Like if we had no emotions in this room, it'd be much better now. Well, it wouldn't be better. And that's, of course, not the way people are made. So first of all, just thinking that the more facile, the more able you are to recognize lots of different emotions, all those color gradations, quite frankly, the more you can have more mastery because you recognize I'm a little bit annoyed, I'm frustrated, I'm rageful, all those different things. The next step up is recognizing your own emotions, being able to, in the moment, but certainly afterwards, why did I feel what I just felt? What's important to me? Why did that push my button or make me really happy? The next level is that self-regulation, being able to begin to manage your emotions and use them effectively. And there's a lot of techniques in the book, and we can talk about that. And then recognizing other people's emotion is the 4th step, and read the room, understand, have empathy, understand what other people feel. And then the last is that emotional mastery in a strategic way, like that example of pounding the table, where you have all those steps. And now you're thinking, not just what am I feeling, but how can I use my emotions in a way that moves my business objectives or my objectives in my role forward, and you express your emotions in a way that has this downstream effect.
I'm sure you can maybe start to surmise I am a very emotional person. So I loved this chapter. And I also think that you reminded us that not everyone is highly emotional. But I do feel that there are so many environmental stressors happening right now in the world that you could start to, it might be that one of those shifts where like you've been in this role you're not in a new role, your identity is not changing, but all of a sudden something comes out and you're being pushed to your edge that you might not have experienced because there are things that are changing around you in your organization suddenly. And that this could be a good place as you're doing the self-awareness work to realize this is like an emotion that I've never experienced. And now I'm experiencing it all the time in my work.
Yeah. And so that first step is what you just talked about, is the awareness, right? Self-awareness that something different is happening and being able to name it. Naming is really helpful. That's what the book is about. That's why I've got 6 areas to focus on and probably 60 plus blind spots that I talk about in the book. So naming is important, and kind of recognize that you've made a step when you've done that. The next step often is advertising about that, talking about it with other people, not just yourself, and figuring out how you want to take the next step with it. And one thing that I think maybe can give some of your listeners some comfort is if you're in a difficult conversation, so if talking about it is difficult because it is very emotional, one way to kind of manage the emotion in a conversation is rise to what's called the meta level of communication. Meta means about. So being able to comment on your feeling while you're feeling it, or comment on what's happening in the conversation while it's happening, you like move to the frame around the picture without being in the picture. And at that point, it already kind of diminishes the emotion. It creates an opportunity for the other person to talk about, for you to say, I don't know why I'm so upset right now, or it seems like we're in a, we're right, kind of at each other at this point, rather than continuing to be at each other. By just saying that, it all of a sudden is like the referee throwing the yellow flag. If things stop for a moment and you have a chance to take a breath. So that naming, and then taking that naming to actually a way where you name and label right in the conversation, is a really powerful tool.
Cool. I want to jump to intellect. You had mentioned traits, emotion, intellect. They're more fixed in
Right.
our model here. What isn't good to know about these four types of intelligence? What can we do here if we're trying to build the awareness, especially as leaders, developing other people or ourselves?
Yeah. So as a psychologist, and I mean, we all grow up with intellect being prized, and the smarter you are, that's better. I mean, that's how we get through school and everything else. And my domain area of psychology is guilty of anybody of kind of over fetishizing intelligence. And then I can't tell you how many times somebody would ask me to meet with somebody and say, talk about how smart the person was, is almost one of the first things. So, but if, when I look about successful leaders, there's a certain amount of smarts that definitely have to be there. But the most successful leaders are not just the smartest person in the room. So what is, really has made me think, as I evaluate leaders for positions, like what is in the intellect area that's important? And so and this is just intuitively for me, there's no research here, but I came up with, as you mentioned, four types of intelligence. So one is the horsepower, which is kind of what we traditionally think with intelligence, people that can just take in a lot of information, analyze it, it's just kind of give me more, and they can handle it all. And it's impressive to see people that can do that. There are people that I've worked with as leaders who are very fast. It's kind of processing speed is even more than the horsepower. And in a situation, they can just, take in what's going on, articulate an idea and bring it out. Maybe that horsepower leader has to go back and pull the spreadsheets out to think about it some more. So that's another type of intellect. A third type is creativity. People who make connections that just don't seem intuitive to other people and seem illogical maybe at times. Sometimes they're annoying in the meeting because they're talking about something and everybody's saying, like, that's not what we're talking about, but they are picking up on some connection there. And there may be some huge value because they're now thinking in a very different way outside the box. And the fourth is what I call street smarts. These are people that just have head on a swivel. There's a lot of emotional intelligence in the street savvy person, is my fourth category. I think all four of those intelligences are needed in major decision making in companies. My advice to a leader is and to any of us, is surround yourself with all those different kinds of intelligence. First, kind of figure out where you're stronger and where you're weaker in there, back to gifts and gaps, and then get the other people in the room. And that creative person, rather than just feeling annoyed when they bring up something that you think is not relevant, ask, like, what are you seeing here? Because I certainly don't see the connection. And they may have it very clear, or they may be just intuitive, and you may help them draw out what's important in that particular point they're making.
I love that advice too. Once you're sharing this language and this way of understanding with other people on your team, I keep wanting to tap back to, it doesn't even have to be leaders. Just when you're working on a project,
Right.
and you're working on a lean team, and you know that someone else has that intellect strength, that they lean towards speed. There's someone that I work with where she gets stuff done. She's got the horsepower and she's got the speed, and I can make sure to latch on to that when that maybe is not my not my strength, so that that awareness and being able to articulate it with other people can help beyond just relying on using it as a leadership skill.
Yeah. And my concept in the book is that if you don't, there's a blind spot there. You've got some area that's not probably being addressed because you didn't have the full kind of ability of other people to kind of help with that.
Yeah. Okay. We still have time to talk about behaviors, which maybe we think about too much. It is back on that outer layer, so closer to awareness. Tell us, what do we need to master here? You break it up into kind of 3 key areas. Tell us about behavior.
Yeah. So first off, all those other things show up in our behavior. I mean, at the end of the day, what other people see is our behavior. And so, I didn't want to just repeat what I had said earlier in the book. I really wanted to focus on what are the complex behaviors that really have led to success in the people I've worked with. I boiled it down to these 3 of communication, influence, and prioritization. And we all are probably pretty good at all of those, but this is one where I think you probably can never be too good. There's always more to learn about all 3 of those. And we've talked a little bit about communication when we talked about the emotions. So maybe I'll just focus a little bit on the other 2. So influence is, that's part of the job, right? Is to influence, a team. And if you're a leader, you're influencing other people. And how do you move things along? And so I talk about 9 types of influence in the book. And again, self-awareness is go down that list, figure out which ones you tend to use all the time. Is your influence, let's do it for the greater good? Is your influence, that's the mission of the company? Is your influence, please do it for me? Is your influence, do it for our relationship? We've been team members together. So we all have natural ways of influencing. And so pay attention to your style, pay attention to what influences the people you're trying to influence. Are they influenced by data, or are they influenced by the relationship they've got with you? I often tell people to have a little virtual 3x5 card, which has on the one side what motivates the person and what influence style you should be using to connect to that motivation. So that's just real quickly on the influence part. On the prioritization, that's kind of what we talked about briefly about the role. And I talk about this in terms of CEOs. What can only the CEO do? And when I've asked CEOs that, I get this blank stare for a second. They felt like, oh my God, I've never really thought about that question. I've thought about, what am I supposed to do? Or what do I need to get done? Or what am I good at? Or what's important? But, just using the CEO, there are some people that only want to talk to the CEO. And you need to think about that. And there are other people that don't really need to talk to the CEO, at least directly, and you need to be delegating and empowering around that. And the CEO should be the owner of the culture in the company. It doesn't mean that they actually do everything about culture, but they should realize, they're in a fishbowl. This is true of every leader at every level. You own the culture by your behavior and about the team you're working with and where your influence spreads. And that should be something that's, a little check mark in the back of your mind almost all the time about that. And I talk about 5 with the CEO, and most of those 5 can apply to any role as you think about it.
I want to jump back to influence just to
Yep.
call out that how empowering that can be for folks who might see that as like a personality trait or strength, or, oh, I don't have that strength. Realizing for all of those stakeholder conversations, talking with your SMEs, that is something that we hear about a lot with our community, that there is some great advice there in this chapter for getting to know your influence style and strengths, and then the folks that you're trying to talk to and what might be motivating for them, and tapping into that, the advice there. I realized that we jumped over, of course, we didn't cover the whole book. We jumped over the big 5 and kind of the traits and personality stuff. So I'll give you an opportunity if there's anything that you want to mention there before we start to close out and chat about you again.
Sure. Yeah, just real quick, that is probably the easiest area to talk about. So in some ways, it's good that we skipped over it. But just real quickly, this is where strengths can get overplayed, your trait strengths. So these are the adjectives that people say about you that, oh, she's decisive or organized or creative. And I would encourage you to get aware of when your strength tips over and becomes a problem simply by putting the modifier TOO in front of it in your brain for a moment. What happens when you're too organized? What happens when you're too creative? What happens when you're too decisive? And can you recognize when it's tipping over and you're overusing your strength? That's the blind spot around traits.
I like it. That's a simple
Yep.
thought exercise to do, or not easy, but feels simple, at least in action to do. Well, speaking of action, before we go back to you, is there one tiny action that you suggest for folks who want to start building self-awareness on blind spots or supporting someone else in their awareness journey?
Well, of course, buy my book. That's the one action. I mean, and in the book, you'll find something will speak to you in there, one of these 6 chapters. And that's where you should start. Or just as you pick up from this conversation today, you don't have to worry about which is the right one or what's more important. It's whatever is speaking to you is probably telling you that you have some awareness that that's an area that you want to improve and get better at. So start there, and then the people you're talking to would be the same question. Maybe provide this framework. So it's a way, again, of organizing that confusion and the way conversations meander, and then have them respond to what's speaking to you right now. What do you want to talk about? And then go down that area to try to help get greater self-awareness. And the one other thing I want to say about this is action-oriented. This is not about transformation. That's a word I would like to have banned from our language. I mean, it's so overused, and I've never transformed anybody, nor could I, nor should I, nor, can anybody transform? A lot of this stuff is fixed. This is about small tweaks in the behavior part. You can make small changes in your behavior that have huge effects. If it becomes a new habit that you practice and you really get good at, and you start doing this one thing differently because you become self-aware, and then figure out what the next thing is after that. So this is all about, coaching comes from sports, and, the golf pro says, change your grip a quarter of an inch, and all of a sudden you get 10 or 20 more yards on your drive, or you have more control over the club. That's what this is all about.
That always feels more doable, more empowering. And I think maybe that will make its way into our description, into our title here. It's not about transformation, it's small tweaks. I love the word tweaks. That's a word that I maybe use too often. This has been so fun. We're running out of time rapidly. So before I let you go, can you tell us how you are currently learning, growing, getting out of your comfort zone? Do you have any learning goals that you're working on right now?
So this whole book thing was not, I never thought I was going to write a book. It wasn't part of so I feel like I'm on a roller coaster actually right now. I'd probably listened to 2 podcasts before I wrote the book, and now I've done 20 podcasts, and I'm about to go on a European tour of a speaking tour, and speaking in Helsinki and Stockholm and Copenhagen and London. And I mean, I've done speaking on and off a little bit, but now I have to change my role that I'm a public speaker now and get comfortable with all of that. And that is a bit of a stretch. As a psychologist, it's not about me, it's about helping the person that I'm with. So getting comfortable with what I'm calling the improbable book tour in my life.
I love it. Are you saying goodbye to any identities right now as you're adding on new roles?
Yeah.
Maybe a shift?
I'm doing just a very small amount of coaching now. And actually, I'm trying to figure out, and I think I'm finding ways to do that not in the traditional way that I've done that, but to do it maybe through these speaking, like what we're doing today, and I'm trying to redefine that. I think that's still in process.
Cool. Oh, well, awesome. I'll have to follow along to see how it all unfolds. Thank you so much, Marty, for making time to chat with the ATD community.
Thank you, Alex. I love the conversation. Thank you for the emotionality.
Thank you to our sponsor, Canvas by Instructure.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the Association for Talent Development. Be sure to check the show notes for resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you found the show useful or insightful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.